Russia's Black Sea Fleet is not retreating. It is collapsing. And the difference between those two words is the entire story of what has happened in the waters south of Crimea over the last 2 years. Let me be precise about what we are witnessing. This is not a navy that took losses and adjusted. This is not a fleet that absorbed punishment and found new operating parameters. What Ukraine has done methodically, doctrinally, with extraordinary ingenuity under existential pressure, is transform the entire Black Sea into a kill zone that Russia's surface fleet can no longer enter, transit, or survive. The flagship is at the bottom of the sea. The naval headquarters in Sevastopol has been struck repeatedly. The Kerch Bridge, which was supposed to be the logistical spine of Russian Crimea, has been hit twice. And the fleet itself, the instrument Russia spent decades building to dominate this theater, has been pushed out of its own home port and driven to the eastern corner of the Black Sea, where it now sits not as a force in being, but as a collection of targets waiting for the range to close. That is not a tactical setback. That is a doctrinal verdict. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened, but why it was always going to happen and why the assumptions Moscow built this fleet around were structurally unsound the moment Ukraine decided it was going to fight back with precision. Pull the lens back for a moment, because the real question is not whether Ukraine damaged Russia's navy. The real question is how a country with no navy of its own, operating under siege conditions with limited Western support in the maritime domain, managed to effectively neutralize a major regional fleet in under 2 years. The answer to that question tells you everything about the adaptation asymmetry at the heart of this war. It tells you everything about why one side has been winning the innovation race while the other has been paying the price of institutional rigidity. And it tells you why Crimea, which Russia treated as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, has become the most strategically precarious piece of territory in the entire conflict. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Because the mainstream framing, Russia lost some ships, the fleet repositioned, the war goes on, misses the magnitude of what has actually occurred. What has occurred is the permanent degradation of Russia's ability to project power, enforce a naval blockade, threaten amphibious operations, or use the Black Sea as a strategic buffer. All of that is gone. And it did not require Ukraine to have a single surface warship to accomplish it. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the assumptions Russia was operating under at the beginning of this war. Because those assumptions were not irrational given the force structure Russia had built, they were simply wrong, and wrong in the most expensive way possible. Russia entered this war with the Black Sea Fleet as a core instrument of its operational design. The fleet's job was multiple and mutually reinforcing. First, it was supposed to enforce a naval blockade that would strangle Ukrainian exports, deny Kiev access to global markets, and apply economic pressure that would accelerate a political collapse. Second, it was supposed to project power along the Ukrainian coastline, threatening amphibious operations that would fix Ukrainian forces in place, disperse their attention, and complicate their defensive posture. Third, and most critically, it was supposed to serve as the logistics backbone for the southern axis, supplying Crimea, supporting ground operations, and maintaining the illusion of Russian strategic depth in the southwestern theater. None of those assumptions survived contact with Ukrainian ingenuity, but here is what made those assumptions so dangerous for Russia. They were built on a framework that was approximately 20 years out of date. The Black Sea Fleet was designed, structured, and mentally optimized for a world where Ukraine had no meaningful anti-ship capability, no precision strike reach into Russian-held maritime space, and no technological sophistication to compensate for the absence of a conventional navy. Russia looked at Ukraine's order of battle at the beginning of this war and saw a country with some coastal artillery, some aging anti-ship missiles, and no surface vessels capable of challenging Russian dominance in the open water. On paper, that assessment was not wrong. In practice, it was catastrophically incomplete because it evaluated Ukraine's capability at a single point in time and assumed that capability was fixed. It did not account for adaptation. It did not account for Western transfers of precision munitions. It did not account for Ukrainian ingenuity in the uncrewed systems domain. And it absolutely did not account for the strategic creativity of a military fighting for its national survival. That asymmetry, a static Russian assumption against a dynamic Ukrainian capability, is the hidden variable that explains everything that has happened since. The first major signal that Russia's naval assumptions were structurally flawed came on April 13th, 2022, when the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was struck by 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles and sunk. Let that number sit for a moment. 2 missiles. Ukraine used 2 missiles to destroy the symbolic and operational centerpiece of Russia's most strategically important naval formation. The Moskva was not supposed to be vulnerable. It was equipped with air defense systems. It was operating in waters that Russia considered controlled. Its loss was not merely a tactical embarrassment, and it was a doctrinal statement. It announced that Russian surface vessels operating within range of Ukraine's coastal strike capability could be found, targeted, and destroyed. And it announced that Russia had no adequate answer to that problem. What happened in the immediate aftermath was instructive. Russia did not adapt its doctrine. It adjusted its positioning. The fleet moved further from the Ukrainian coastline, which reduced the threat vector, but also reduced the fleet's operational utility. A navy that cannot operate within range of the adversary's coast cannot enforce a blockade, cannot credibly threaten amphibious landings, and cannot provide meaningful fire support to ground operations. Russia had not solved the problem. It had simply traded capability for survivability, and in doing so, had already begun the process of strategic self-neutralization. But the adaptation race did not stop there. Ukraine was learning, iterating, and extending its reach. And here is where the story shifts from conventional anti-ship warfare into something more historically significant. Somewhere in the period that followed, Ukrainian engineers and military planners began developing what would become one of the most innovative and consequential capabilities of this entire war: the maritime uncrewed surface vehicle. The naval drone, a small, fast, GPS-guided vessel packed with explosives, capable of operating at night, at long range, with a radar cross-section that made it extraordinarily difficult for Russian air defense systems to detect and engage reliably. These were not weapons that existed in any military doctrine manual. They were not weapons that Russia had trained against or built countermeasures for. They were a product of necessity, the kind of innovation that emerges when a military is fighting for survival and conventional solutions are unavailable. And they worked. The naval drone campaign against the Black Sea Fleet did not begin with a single dramatic operation. It built systematically over months as Ukraine refined the technology, extended the operational range, and identified the points of maximum Russian vulnerability. The attack on the Kerch Bridge in October 2022 was the first major signal of what was coming. Kerch was not just infrastructure, it was the physical and psychological symbol of Russian control over Crimea. The bridge Putin had personally inaugurated, the structure that tied the peninsula to the Russian mainland and made the logistics of occupation viable. Striking, it was a statement about reach, about will, and about Ukraine's refusal to accept the strategic geography that Russia had tried to impose. The bridge was damaged, repaired, damaged again, and each time it was struck, the message was the same. There is no safe infrastructure in this theater. Russia's assumptions about what was protected and what was reachable were wrong. But the campaign against the fleet itself was escalating on a parallel track. Ukrainian naval drones began striking Russian vessels in Sevastopol harbor, the main base of the Black Sea Fleet, a port city that Russian military planners had assumed was beyond Ukraine's effective reach. The logic of that assumption had been straightforward. Sevastopol was far from the front lines, deep inside Russian-controlled Crimea, surrounded by air defense systems, and accessible only through heavily monitored sea lanes. It was in the Russian operational framing a sanctuary. Ukraine ended the sanctuary. The landing ship Olenogorski Gornyak was struck in August 2023, listing badly after a drone impact that caused serious structural damage. The submarine Rostov-on-Don and the landing ship Minsk were struck in a single-night operation in September 2023, both suffering damage significant enough to require extended repair periods that, in at least one case, effectively removed the vessel from operational service. And then the naval drone attacks on Sevastopol itself became a sustained campaign, not individual operations, but a systematic, repeated assault on the fleet's ability to use its own home port. Pull the lens back. What you are watching is not a series of lucky strikes. What you are watching is Ukraine executing a methodical campaign to deny Russia the use of its naval sanctuary by demonstrating repeatedly and expensively that the sanctuary does not exist. Every attack on Sevastopol harbor is not just about the ship that is struck. It is about the message delivered to every ship captain, every admiral, every planner in the Russian naval chain of command. Your port is not safe. Your vessels are not protected. The waters around Crimea are contested, and they will remain contested, and there is no operational posture available to you that changes that fundamental reality. Now, let me address the industrial and strategic dimension of this campaign, because this is where the mainstream analysis consistently fails to capture the true magnitude of what has occurred. Russia cannot simply replace what it has lost. That statement requires emphasis because it cuts against a common assumption about Russian military power, the assumption that Russia's sheer size, its industrial base, and its access to raw materials means that losses can eventually be absorbed and replaced. In certain domains, that assumption has validity. Russia has been able to replace artillery ammunition to some degree. It has been able to reconstitute some ground force formations, but naval vessels are not artillery shells. They are complex, high-technology platforms that require years to build, sophisticated supply chains to maintain, and a shipbuilding industry that, and this is the critical point, is under severe strain from Western sanctions, export controls on critical components, and the structural degradation that comes from operating a wartime economy under technological isolation. The Moskva cannot be replaced. There is no vessel in the Russian naval order of battle that can step into the role of Black Sea Fleet flagship with equivalent capability. The submarines and landing ships that have been damaged or destroyed represent years of production capacity and billions of dollars in sunk investment. And the shipyards capable of building replacements are operating at reduced efficiency, facing shortages of precision components, electronics, and specialized materials that Russia can no longer easily import. What this means at the strategic level is that the degradation of the Black Sea Fleet is not a temporary condition. It is not a setback that Russia recovers from in 2 or 3 years and returns to its prior operational posture. The losses are permanent in any strategically relevant time horizon. The fleet that Russia has today in the Black Sea is smaller, less capable, more psychologically defensive, and more operationally constrained than the fleet it had in February 2022. And the trajectory is toward further degradation, not recovery. And it gets even more serious from here, because the strategic consequences of fleet degradation extend far beyond the naval domain. The Black Sea Fleet was not just a collection of warships. It was the instrument through which Russia maintained the option of amphibious threat against the Ukrainian coastline. As long as the fleet was credible, Ukraine had to allocate forces, attention, and defensive infrastructure to the coastal threat. Ukrainian units had to account for the possibility of Russian amphibious operations against Odessa, against the Mykolaiv region, against positions along the southern coast. That threat fixed Ukrainian resources. It imposed a planning burden. It constrained Ukrainian operational freedom in the south. That threat no longer exists in any operationally meaningful form. Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations against the Ukrainian mainland has been effectively eliminated by the combination of fleet losses, repositioning requirements, and the demonstrated lethality of Ukrainian maritime strike capability. The resources Ukraine previously had to allocate to coastal defense have been partially freed. The strategic options available to Ukrainian planners in the southern theater have expanded, and the psychological burden of the amphibious threat, which was never inconsiderable, has been removed. That is not a tactical gain. That is a theater-level strategic shift. The most significant single operation in this campaign, The one that, in my judgment, represents the clearest doctrinal verdict on the entire Black Sea campaign was the series of strikes that forced Russia to relocate the bulk of its Black Sea fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Let me be precise about what that relocation means, because the significance is not immediately obvious if you are looking at a map and seeing only the movement of vessels from one port to another. Novorossiysk is a commercial port. It is not a naval base designed to support and sustain a major fleet formation. Its infrastructure, its maintenance facilities, its depth and configuration are all optimized for cargo operations, not warship sustainment. Moving the Black Sea Fleet to Novorossiysk is not a tactical repositioning. It is a strategic retreat to a location where the fleet is less capable, less maintainable, and less operationally useful, all in exchange for marginally greater distance from Ukrainian strike range. And even that distance is not permanent. Ukraine has continued to extend the range of its naval drone operations. Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicles have been documented operating at distances that threaten vessels even in the eastern Black Sea. The tactical adjustment Russia made, trade capability for survivability by moving to Novorossiysk, is itself under increasing pressure. The sanctuary is shrinking. And as Ukraine receives additional Western precision strike capabilities, as the naval drone program continues to mature and extend its operational radius, the question of whether any location in the Black Sea remains genuinely safe for Russian surface vessels becomes increasingly difficult to answer with confidence. The fleet is not in a new home. It is in a slightly more distant killing field. Now, the hidden military variable that mainstream analysis almost universally misses in this story is the role of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. The Ukrainian strikes against the Black Sea Fleet have not been lucky. They have been enabled by a maritime ISR architecture that combines satellite intelligence from Western partners, signals intelligence derived from Russian naval communications and radar emissions, and the targeting precision that comes from operating in a contested theater where every Russian movement generates detectable signatures. Ukraine is not guessing where Russian vessels are. Ukraine is tracking them. And the combination of tracking capability with the growing range and lethality of Ukrainian strike options means that the problem Russia faces is not a tactical one. It is a surveillance problem, a persistent structural inability to hide from a targeting architecture that the fleet was never designed to operate against. Let me now take you through the climax of this campaign, the moment that, in strategic terms, confirmed that the transformation of Crimea from Russian sanctuary to Russian vulnerability was complete and irreversible. The strikes on Sevastopol Naval Headquarters, a facility that has been hit multiple times, that has sustained significant damage, and that represents not just a building, but the entire command and administrative architecture of the Black Sea Fleet, were not chosen for their physical effect alone. They were chosen because they were the single target that most visibly and unambiguously demonstrated that Russia's naval command structure, operating in what it considered its most protected and significant installation, was exposed. The headquarters of a major fleet is not supposed to be a target. It is supposed to be a backstop, the location to which you retreat when everything else is under threat. When the backstop is being struck regularly, the message is unambiguous. There is no backstop. There is no position of safety available to the Black Sea Fleet Command. The entire institutional architecture of Russian naval power in this theater is operating under persistent threat. That is a psychological and operational condition that compounds over time. Officers who cannot operate from secure headquarters make different decisions than officers who can. Planners who know their facilities are targeted think differently about risk, about positioning, about the advisability of offensive operations. The accumulated psychological weight of persistent vulnerability is not measurable in the way that a sunken ship is measurable, but it is real, and it shapes behavior in ways that degrade operational effectiveness far beyond what the physical losses alone would suggest. And here in this accumulated degradation, the sunken flagship, the damaged submarines, the struck headquarters, the relocated fleet, the extended range drone campaign, the persistent ISR envelope, is where we find the larger pattern that this entire campaign confirms. Ukraine did not beat the Black Sea Fleet by out-navying Russia. Ukraine beat the Black Sea Fleet by outthinking Russia, by innovating faster, by identifying the gaps in Russian doctrine, the assumption that Crimea was a sanctuary, the assumption that Ukraine lacked reach, the assumption that naval vessels required a naval adversary, and exploiting those gaps with capabilities that Russia had neither anticipated nor prepared countermeasures for. The pattern is the same pattern visible across every domain of this war. Russian static assumptions defeated by Ukrainian dynamic adaptation. Russian institutional rigidity defeated by Ukrainian improvisation. Russian mass defeated by Ukrainian precision. The Black Sea Fleet is the maritime proof of a thesis that is being written in every theater of this war. The side that adapts wins, and Russia has not been adapting. It has been repositioning, absorbing, adjusting at the margins, while the fundamental doctrinal deficit remains unaddressed. What does this mean going forward? Let me be direct, because strategic forecasting is not speculation, and it is the application of doctrinal logic to observe trends, and the trends here point in one direction. Crimea is no longer a strategic asset for Russia. It has become a strategic liability. The peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014 to secure its Black Sea position, to protect Sevastopol, to project power into the wider maritime theater, that peninsula is now a target that requires constant defense, a logistics challenge that the degraded Kerch Bridge makes increasingly difficult to sustain, and a symbol of Russian overextension rather than Russian strength. Every resource Russia commits to defending Crimea is a resource not available for other operational priorities. Every missile fired at Ukrainian strikes on Crimea is a missile not fired at Ukrainian ground forces. The peninsula has been transformed from a force multiplier into a force drain, and the Black Sea itself, which Russia intended to dominate as a strategic lake, as a buffer zone, as a maritime highway for power projection, has become the geography of Russian naval humiliation. The fleet that was supposed to control it cannot safely operate in it. The ports that were supposed to sustain it are under persistent threat. The amphibious capability that was supposed to give Russia southern strategic depth has been effectively neutralized. History will record this as one of the most remarkable naval campaigns of the 21st century, not because of the scale of the forces involved. By historical standards, the Black Sea Fleet was not the largest or most powerful formation ever committed to a maritime campaign, but because of the asymmetry it demonstrated, because of what it proved about the relationship between innovation and institutional rigidity, between adaptation and assumption, between a military that learns under pressure and a military that calcifies under it. Ukraine had no navy. Ukraine built the capability to defeat one, and in doing so, it permanently altered the strategic geometry of the Black Sea theater, denied Russia one of its core operational instruments, and demonstrated a principle that every military planner in every NATO capital should be studying with the closest possible attention. In modern warfare, the side that controls the innovation cycle controls the battlefield. Mass matters less than adaptation. Doctrine matters less than ingenuity. And the assumptions that looked like advantages at the beginning of a conflict can become the architecture of defeat by the time it ends. The Black Sea Fleet is not coming back to Sevastopol as a dominant force. That chapter is closed. What comes next? What happens to Crimea itself as Ukrainian capabilities continue to mature, as the logistical pressure on the peninsula intensifies, as the strategic cost of holding it continues to compound? Those are questions that do not yet have final answers. But the direction of the answers is visible, and it runs in only one direction. Stay with us, because those questions are going to determine the shape of this war's conclusion, and they are not going to wait much longer to be resolved.